Hello, students. My name is Sister Anna Rolap. I will be your instructor for this class, Interior Design. I think it's 123 section. Well, there are several different sections, so the one I'm teaching at the moment doesn't really matter because those of you that are watching this recording will be different sections. So happy to be teaching this class. I've taught it for the last year several times as a Zoom class during COVID. And now this, for the first time, I've been asked to record the lecture so that you can take a completely online class. So we'll see how this goes. I apologize. I've got a little bit of a head cold. I've got my cough drops unwrapped and ready to go if I need them, and a drink close by. So I want to make sure that you've ordered your swatch kit. If you haven't done that, you've got to go ahead and get that done yesterday. You're going to need it during the class today if you have it. And I'll be using a couple of other visual aids besides that swatch kit for our lecture today. So let's jump right into class number 1. I will say our opening prayer for today and for most classes since you're online and you're not able to take your turn saying the opening prayer. If I skip the opening prayer in some of our subsequent classes, you go ahead and just say it yourself. And that's how it will work, okay? Our Father in heaven, we start this semester with gratitude in our hearts for the opportunity that we have to learn and take college courses and better ourselves through our college educations, which will lead hopefully to satisfying careers. We ask thee that we will be alert during this class, that we will be able to learn along with Sister Rolap, that we'll be able to learn about textiles as they relate to in the interior design world. We're grateful for all that we have, and we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. I'm using similar slides to what I use for my Zoom classes, so some of them won't make sense. For example, we're not going to be taking attendance. But I will be sending you an email in the next couple of days asking you some questions so that I can get to know a little bit more about you. And I'll tell you some things about me right now. 2 or 3 things that you should know about me. I love to exercise. I exercise several times a week. Learning new technology like Canvas and Dashboard has felt like learning a new language when I started teaching this class a little over a year ago. So that was tricky for me. Fortunately, I have 4 adult kids. I guess I shouldn't even call them kids, 4 adult children that are adults that are your ages and older that help me with the technology from time to time. I love textiles, and I've made many, many, many quilts, and I also love making wedding dresses and reproduction period clothing. If you read my online profile, you'll see that I am a full-time church service missionary, and I'm currently the one that makes all of the reproduction textiles for all of the historic sites, so you can read a little bit about that in my profile. It's a mission that I absolutely love and that I'm really quite well suited to do. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity. Picture of me and my family. This card is a New Year's card, a little bit outdated, that told a little bit about our family. So some other things that I love to do. I love all kinds of outdoor activities, whitewater rafting. I go most summers. I ski all winter. I bike, I hike, I swim. I just love to be outside. I love to be in the water. As I mentioned before, I have several quilts and other textiles in LDS historic sites and in other museums. And my husband, my 4 grown children, and 4 grandchildren are my greatest blessings. So as I've mentioned, I love all kinds of textiles, and we'll be learning about them in this class. So a couple reminders. Some of these won't apply to you because this list was made for my other classes that are taught via Zoom. I will share all the slides with you. No, you have access to the slides. Ensign College dress code is to be honored. Certainly, taking an online class, nobody's going to come into your bedroom and see if you're honoring the dress code, but be respectful in taking the class. Get out of bed, sit at a desk to watch the lectures, to do your homework. Be professional. I know some of the things that I have learned in life is, I'll just review a couple of them quickly. Number 1, be on time for everything. Just if you show up, that makes half the difference. Number 2, be neat in all of your work and in your appearance. And number three, we'll probably talk about later. But there are things, some basic things that you need to learn. So honor the class by getting out of bed and getting dressed when you do your work. Children are not to be in the room with you during class. Of course, that would be an instruction that we have for an online class when you're doing for a Zoom class. On an online class, we certainly have to be more flexible with what you do. You won't be showing me your image because you'll be watching this on your own time. You're not going to be sharing verbally in the chat or in breakout rooms, and attendance I will not be taking. But we're in a crazy new world, as we have been the last couple of years, and just, be in touch if you have any particular concerns. Also, if you haven't posted your picture on Blackboard, I need you to do that. There are 1 or 2 students each semester that are slow to do that, but I like to see what you look like. I like to have an image of you as I'm discussing things with you. We're not going to write in chat, certainly because we're not online together. But just keep in touch with me if you have questions about the syllabus. Already before this first lecture, several students have been in touch with me about a few problems that they're having with the class and some questions of all. You watched a video to prepare for this class, and we'll review that the second half of class today. For some reason, my mouse isn't working, so give me just a minute here to get that going today. There we go. The videos that you watch each week will generally review those at the beginning of the class, but today it has more to do with the second half of class. So we'll wait for our review on that. So today the class is divided into 2 sections. The first half is going to help us understand the aesthetics of fabric, the color, the light, the texture, pattern, and market appropriateness to the categories that we'll break that down into. Is that 4 or 5? 4 categories. The second half of class will refer us to the lecture that you watched before class, and it'll help us understand the designer's role in sustainable design. So if you take nothing else from this class, I want you to realize that what you do as designer begins with what you do at home. You need to start practicing all of the principles that we talk about in your own home, your bedroom, or in your furnishings. You may be living in an apartment, a home, or even your parents' basement, or with your brother and sister-in-law, but you can still practice the principles that we talk about within your own home and with your own supplies. With your own personal decor. So I want you to think of that as we go through these lectures. How can I practice them at home? All right, so starting with aesthetics of fabric, how fabric looks to us. You may or may not be familiar with his very famous dress. It became an internet sensation some years ago. I believe it was in 2015. And some people see it as black and blue. Some people see it as gold and white. It's really very, very interesting. Color is subjective. We cannot even agree on the color of the colors of this dress. If this were a Zoom class right now, I would have you record in chat the colors that you see. And when I've done this for the several classes I've chatted, it's about divided. Half of the class members see it as black and blue. The other half see it as gold and white. I actually see it as black and blue. But it became, like I said, an internet sensation in 2015 when viewers disagreed on the color. A woman posted the picture of the dress on social media as the one that she had chosen to wear to her daughter's wedding. But no one could agree on the 2 colors of the wedding. And the phenomenon revealed that we have differences in human color perception. And this, of course, has been the subject of ongoing scientific investigation. This dress image on Facebook eventually got over 500,000 hits and then was the subject of about 4.5 million tweets within 24 hours. It's interesting. Some years ago, in viewing a sunset with my daughter, one of us described the sunset, and it became apparent that the 2 of us were seeing different colors. we saw completely different colors, and this particular daughter also sees this dress as white and gold, whereas I see it as blue and black. So the dress was eventually confirmed as blue and black, though a gold and white one was eventually made for a charity auction. So quite an interesting thing on the aesthetics of fabric and color. Okay, so this is, as I said, our topic for the first half of class, aesthetics of fabric, color, light, texture, pattern, and market appropriateness. Okay, so first let's talk about the 5 characteristics. Well, here are the 5 characteristics of fabric. So if I were in a classroom with you or on Zoom with you, I would ask you a couple of questions. Why do designers love to work with fabric? So I wish I could see into your homes right now and pull these questions out of you. I think it's because we like to work with fabric because it's such a tactile thing. I mean, I just love playing with fabric and talking about fabric and holding fabric in my hands. And I'll be sharing some samples with you in just a minute. But fabrics can be the dominant feature in a room, and they have such endless decorative potential, and they have a relative low cost compared to the price of furnishings. So these are just some of the reasons why designers like to work with fabric. So let's talk more about the aesthetics of color. I introduced that a moment ago with that picture of that famous dress on the internet. Fabric is first chosen for its color. Many of you have already taken color theory here at Ensign College. But before we decide on texture or pattern, we choose color, or your client is going to choose color. But we have to agree with clients as they may see color differently, as we now know. Number 2, color never appears flat. Again, my mouse is taking a vacation with some other mice, apparently. Color never appears flat, and I've got some samples here, and looking at them on this video, they perhaps are going to appear flat to you, but I've got some beige fabrics that are 3 different types of fabric. I've got a beige, kind of a linen, a synthetic, a silk, and a linen rayon blend. And they're all kind of beige-ish. They're all kind of beige looking, but they have different characteristics if you look at them up close. The client, number 3, has to find the color pleasing. And this is the only true rule of fabric with your clients. They must find the color pleasing. It's more important than if you find the color pleasing. First of all, you're going to start doing design projects for yourself so that you can, get to work with colors that you like. But eventually, you're going to be working with colors that are pleasing to your client. Number 4, color has culturally devised connotation. In America, black fabric represents what? Or black clothing, and that generally represents death, doesn't it? And white, in general, in America, represents weddings or births, right? So, but in some countries, white represents mourning. So it's kind of culturally derived what color represents in different places. Number 4, color has culturally devised connotations. We talked about that just now. Number 5, there are perils in using white and beige. They can both be in the cool or the warm spectrum, but when they're used, remember that the more neutral a scheme, the more noticeable the other details become. So we kind of have to be careful in our very, very neutrals. Color actually never appears flat to us. As you look at these 4 fabrics, the one on the left is a wool, then a silk, a polyester, and then a cotton. They're all beige, but they look different because they're a composite of fibers and threads, different fibers and threads. So fibers can be manipulated in different ways to change how color looks. So you can see that from these 4 beige samples. They're all beige, but they look very, very, the beige samples that I showed you a minute ago, they're all beige, but they look very, very differently, and you'd see that if you had a chance to examine them up closely. They're all beige, but they look differently because of the fibers that are in them. So, good video. Who doesn't love a little bit of Anne Hathaway and Meryl Streep when they're talking about color and all that went into the making or the choosing of the color for Anne Hathaway's lumpy, lumpy sweater. So a good video that teaches a little bit about color and how important it is. So as I said before, you're gonna, you need to start paying attention to what colors you like and the reason that you like your colors before you're going to be comfortable talking to your clients about the colors that they like. So our second objective under aesthetics is going to be light. So let's talk a little bit about how the aesthetics or how fabric looks is determined by light. So color certainly is determined by light. It's important to look at fabrics, paint samples, wallpaper, carpeting, all of those things in the light in which they're going to be used. Because color is determined by light. How it looks in a showroom is not necessarily going to be the same as how it looks in your home. Changes in light seldom affect the relationships between colors. The relationships kind of all stay the same in the changes of light. Number 3, end users, your clients, are sophisticated and are aware that there are multiple alternatives. For instance, if your client lives in a tropical area, they usually have bright colors there, but your client may prefer kind of subtle colors, even if they live in that, for example, a tropical area. If you have a flashlight, if you have your phone handy, go ahead and turn the flashlight feature of your phone on. And if you turn the flashlight on in your phone, I want you to look at look at your pants. If you're wearing some jeans right now or some dark colored pants, you're going to look at something in your room and see that if you shine the flashlight on it, it's going to look very, very different. I'm shining, right down on the bottom of my dress, and the part that is underneath my desk is hidden in the shade, and it looks very, very different than the navy blue that is in the light of my flashlight. Notice how light affects the color, doesn't it? My pants that are half shadowed look very, very different than the color that is exposed by the flashlight. So light does affect color tremendously. Here are 2 silk canvases. The one on the left is extremely large. The one on the right, I'll show you, the actual one is very, very small. It's a beautiful art called Threads of Light, and I wish I could show you either one of these canvases in person. It's quite an incredible art that is created with just literally thousands of individual threads of silk. And one of the characteristics of silk is that it reflects light. And there was an artist in Southern California, actually in Los Angeles some years ago, who knew something about a Chinese embroidery practice called Threads of Light. To make a long story short, this Robert Glenn Ketchum went to Sundance, Utah, and he took many, many photographs of, pictures of trees and things from nature. And then he eventually got a grant from UCLA, and he used the money to help revive this art of Threads of Light in Suzhou, the Suzhou province of China. He started the Suzhou Embroidery Research Institute. And I just happened to be in Xi'an, China, visiting the Terracotta Warriors, and my daughter saw this amazing canvas, the one that you see on the left of your screen. So I bought the canvas for quite a large amount of money. I brought it home, researched it, had it framed, and it has loved it as one of my favorite pieces of art. And why am I showing this to you? It's because the canvas with its millions of threads of light, reflects light. It's one of the properties of silk. Your eye is drawn into the canvas due to one of the properties of light, of silk, that it reflects light, which is what we're talking about, how light helps determine how fabric looks. As I mentioned before, the photo illustrates how color changes in various types of light, but the relationships between objects does not change. For example, the cushions are a lighter color than the couch, and that does not change in the different types of light. The relationships do not change. So texture is the third characteristic of fabric, or the third aesthetic of fabric. It is determined by several things, by fiber content, density, weave, and other factors. I've got some samples here to show you. Looks like I don't have the ones that I want right on hand at the moment. Texture is inseparable from fabric. The word texture is derived, actually, from the Latin word textere, meaning to weave. And I thought I had that one here. Let me keep going through this pile. Showing you. Well, I'll show you on this one. This is actually a piece of a hand-woven rug. And you can generally hear texture. As I run my fingernails across this, you can actually hear the texture because there's so many bumps and grooves and nooks and crannies to it. So the weave or the texture gives it a particular look. It's a particular characteristic, texture is, of fabric. Okay, we have a little song on texture. I might have forgotten to download. Excuse me. This one, but you're not missing much. It's a song about texture. It would be a little bit insulting actually for me to play this video. It's a preschool video. It's about texture. It talks about texture being fuzzy, hard, prickly, fluffy, squishy, woven. So we looked at this texture. I don't know if we would describe it as a woven texture. We would probably describe this one, if you can see it, as a fluffy texture. This one is kind of squishy and a little bit fuzzy as well. So there are all kinds of words that preschool students would use to describe the texture. I think you get the idea. All right, so we've discussed a little bit about the aesthetics of fabric in terms of color, light, texture. Now let's talk about pattern. Motifs and their arrangement on the fabric constitute the pattern, right? So we're going to look at some patterns on fabrics right now. Pattern is often confused with repeat. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Pattern is continuous. Generally, one exception would be handmade fabrics such as batiks don't have that continuous pattern that we're talking about. And to further emphasize that, fabric is rarely produced without repeat. So repeat is a term that you need to know as you work with fabric. It may be something that you've come across before in your classes, or it may be a new term for you. So I'm going to teach you how to measure repeat. So we start with a basic tape measure. I just happen to have one here in my drawer. And I happen to have a piece of fabric right here that is just the same one that you're seeing in the image on the screen. Okay, so to measure the repeat on this particular piece of fabric, I would run the tape measure across the fabric until I find a matching pattern. So on this one, we've got this interesting floral whorl right here, and we're going to put the tape measure right at the bottom of that image and then run it up here and measure until we see that same image again and measure that distance between the bottom of that image and the bottom of that image. That's where the repeat begins again. So the repeat is actually 24.5 inches. We measure from one part of the fabric until we see that same design repeated again. So we know the repeat on this fabric is 24 inches. That's so important to know when you're buying fabric for couches, for chairs. You need to know what the repeat is. So I'm going to hold those areas with my fingers. I don't know if you can see that very well. You can see the repeat, and I've actually marked it with a line on this particular fabric to show you where that repeat starts and ends. But as you're buying fabric for a couch or for a chair or any type of an upholstery project, curtains, you need to know what that repeat is because that's going to have to match at different places. It's very important with wallpaper as well. You need to understand what the repeat is. So it's just how often or how many inches until that design repeats itself. The image on the other side of your screen is a pattern without a repeat, and I'm holding up that same fabric right here. This is what's called a batik or a handmade fabric, and handmade fabrics generally have no repeat. The batiks, think of tie-dye fabric that you might have made yourself. The pattern is just very, very random since it's handmade. It's not meant to have a particular repeat on it. So handmade fabrics, hand-dyed fabrics generally have no repeat, such as our batiks and our tie-dyed fabrics. Continuing to talk about, excuse me, about pattern. Let me grab a cough drop. Something like a very, very busy rug that we see in the image on the left of your screen work extremely well in a very, very large area, but they wouldn't work so well in a small area. So also patterns look very different when used on furniture versus drapes. If you can see in this picture here, it might be a little hard to see unless you've enlarged it on your screen. The same fabric is on the couch that's on the folds of these curtains, but since it's lying flat on the couch, it looks very different than it does in the large folds on a curtain. So pattern can be kind of manipulated to look different ways. Let's talk about just one slide to talk about market appropriateness. You're going to have to remember that when you're choosing fabrics, it's going to be the personal taste of your client, not your personal taste. But as you first choose choose fabrics for yourself and get used to working with fabrics yourself, then you'll be better equipped to discuss them with your clients down the line. The personal taste of your client primarily dictates the market appropriateness. You may think that pink is a horrible color to put in a dining room, but your client might love pink in a dining room. I've actually had a pink dining room before, not the one that is shown in this image, but in a house that we owned several years ago. You'll find in this class that I have owned a lot of homes. My husband and I currently live in 3 different homes, so I'll be using a lot of pictures from our homes and relying a lot on projects that I have done in the past for our homes. But the personal taste of your client, number one, primarily dictates what's appropriate, and it may not be, you may not agree with it. Agree with the personal taste of your client. Number 2, conference rooms and lobbies can be very, very dramatic. You can use larger scale patterns and very dramatic looks, more so than you would in a smaller area. Primarily because little time is spent there. So this intense color and bold patterns can be used. But offices, for example, are a different story. Most people work better in offices that are not too visually stimulating, with medium values and remembering that small scale patterns and textures tend to disguise wear and soiling a little bit better. Number 3, restaurants may host the spectrum of color. They can be calm or lively, depending on the type of the restaurant that they are. And generally, pinks are thought to increase appetite in rooms. Like this slide that we're looking at, pink is supposed to increase appetite. I once had a pink dining room, as I mentioned before, and people tend to linger in that dining room. I don't know if they had an increased appetite or not, but they were very comfortable sitting in that pink diet room and tended to stay there a long time. Number 4, healthcare applications should be more practical than some of the other places that we work with. And you would certainly avoid colors that denote death and blood. And I think you know what those colors are. Black, red, possibly purple are colors that you would definitely not want to use in a healthcare application. Number 5, end users' opinions are going to be broad and varied. And back to your client, their desires may or may not fit into normal patterns of what would be called market appropriateness, and their desires for color you may not agree with at all, but you've got to kind of be able to wrap your head around what the client wants to do. Okay, let's continue now with the second half of our lecture. We've spent the first half discussing the aesthetics of fabric, specifically color, light, texture, pattern, and market appropriateness. And we took a little distraction. We had a little distraction by looking at some royalty wearing various dresses that kind of help us look at the aesthetics or the different characteristics of fabric. So now let's move to the second half of our lecture that talks about understanding the designer's role in sustainable design. We're going to talk about green manufacturing, fabric use issues, considerations for specific materials. And of course, you would have watched the video before watching this lecture. In the video, we were taught to make just small shifts in our thinking, like not using plastic straws and having meat-free Mondays, just for a couple of examples. I'm not ready to give up my plastic straws. I just have to throw that in. I do not like paper straws. Plastic straws for me. But most are surprised, and I was as well when I watched this video, that natural fibers have to go through many different processes, washes, bleaching, etc., before they can become fabric. And synthetics, which are in wide use today, certainly take less steps to process and to become recyclable. So also keeping natural fibers clean is certainly more difficult than keeping synthetics clean. And the synthetics will generally last longer, which has been kind of a shift in previous years. The synthetics used to not be as great a performance fabrics as they are today. So an example, I had a linen sofa some years ago from Restoration Hardware, and the linen wore out after a few years versus a synthetic performance fabric that I can compare it to that lasts a little bit quite a bit longer. As an example of sustainability, recycled yarn, for example, from the fashion industry can be used for upholstery fabric, making beautiful multicolored weaves. We learned about this in the video. And due to the green movement, designers' jobs have become a lot more complex, haven't they? Not only must you, as a designer, choose products that are going to be beautiful, they have to be held up to very, very high standards and be suitable for their end use, but designers have to also consider the environmental consequences of the product. So your job has certainly become a little bit more complicated than in years past. So green manufacturing, let's talk about that for a minute. The U.S. textile industry is committed to environmental awareness and has been for several decades. Fiber companies market a broadening range of recycled fibers and yarns. Harmful chemicals for dyeing and after treatments have long ago been eliminated. When disposal of these items is expensive, manufacturers prefer to reuse all that they can. So recyclable materials, including yarn and fabric, scraps, packaging, and storing materials, and machine oil are often recycled as much as they possibly can be. Number two, green manufacturing can be economical. Excuse me. But many third world countries have kind of low standards in sustainable design and no governmental regulations on fabric production, so they're not necessarily paying attention to green manufacturing as much as we're expected to in a large developed country. Number three, European standards meet or exceed those in the United States. But as I mentioned before, many developing countries have low standards in sustainable design and have no governmental regulations on fabric production. So big differences between the developing world and the developed world. So pop quiz right now. I want you to guess how many pounds of textiles, including all kinds of textiles, including upholstery, shoes, clothing, towels, bedding, does the average American, that's you, how much does the average American throw away every year? Write down a number, whatever you think that is, in pounds. How many pounds of textiles do you throw away every year? Remember, you're going to think about all kinds of textiles. So my students in other classes have guessed from 10 to 1,000 pounds. Very, very broad range of answers. So we're told in this slide that 65 pounds of textiles are trashed by each citizen per year. And that adds up to about 13 million tons of textiles are trashed each year. And 45% of us trash perfectly recyclable textiles. So what are our options for recycling clothes? We don't have to throw them in the trash, do we? And I'm sure you're thinking you could give them to a friend, you could give them to a sibling, you could drop them off at Deseret Industries or Goodwill so that they can be repurposed. We've got to constantly be thinking about reduce, reuse, recycle. And we're talking in terms of clothing and other textiles, but let's think in terms of upholstery as well. How can we recycle textiles? Reduce, reuse, recycle. That's what we need to think about all the time. The sweater on the left, I often wear that sweater when I'm teaching this particular lecture, but it happens to be in a different house. I'm teaching this from Newport Beach, California right now, and that sweater happens to be in Salt Lake City, Utah. But you can see a little bit of the jacket that is behind that. I had bought a new jacket a few years ago. I needed just the right sweater to go with it. So I had an old cashmere gray bathrobe that I was no longer using. So I decided to turn that into a wrap around sweater to go with that jacket. So I, cut off the bathrobe and certainly hemmed it. And then I added some decorative embroidery trim on it to pick up the light blue on the jacket. And voila, I had recycled a bathrobe into a great jacket. The image on the right is of a very, very cozy blanket. It happens to be nearby, so I'm going to go grab it. So this is a blanket that I made some years ago. I cut up a lot of old gray cashmere sweaters and turned it into the most cozy blanket. Like I said, I've had a little bit of a cold, so when I take a little nap, this is the blanket that I want. It's just so cozy and comfortable because it's made out of all these wonderful cashmere sweaters. So I gave them a brand new use. I recycled them into this wonderful blanket that is now one of my favorite. I'm draping it over my lap right now because I'm a little bit cool. So there are many things that we can do to reduce, reuse, recycle, can't we? I think you get the idea, and it's a concept that you're certainly very, very familiar with. So let's talk a little bit more about sustainable design and fabric use issues. Number one, good design. When a product really works, its life is going to be long. So if we use quality materials from the beginning, we decrease the need for disposal and generate less garbage. So reuse is the simplest way to recycle. So we're starting out with really, really good materials so that we don't have to recycle it or reuse that very soon. It's going to last longer if we're using good materials from the beginning. Number two, cleaning and caring for installed fabrics are both extremely important. And just as you know how dirty clothing doesn't last long, neither does soiled upholstery. So upholstery, carpet, and window coverings must be regularly vacuumed and professionally cleaned. Fabric is not going to last long if stains are ignored. So a future lecture that we're going to have is going to cover this a little bit more specifically. Number three, disposal of fabric. Most natural fibers and some of the synthetics are biodegradable, meaning that they're going to break down in trash heaps. So fabrics compared to an entire chair kind of have a minor impact on the environment because they are going to break down in trash piles. Number four, green design requires interior designers and architects to consider sustainable alternatives. So it takes a lot of effort to look ahead to end uses that are going to look towards sustainable design. But that's one of the jobs that you have as an interior designer, to kind of keep that in mind and help keep your client aware of that. This is a chair that I recently recycled that's actually in the room where I'm sitting. You may or may not be able to see it. Let's see, it's behind me. Can you see it over there in the corner just a bit if I move out of the way? That actual chair. It's a chair I recently recycled. I took two old Ralph Lauren quilts that were very, very used, had some stains on them, and I simply upholstered the bench and then the back cushion from one quilt, and then I draped the chair with the other quilt. So it was a very, very simple process. And then I was able to camouflage the stains on the two old quilts. So a great use of an old chair that my husband wanted to get rid of because the upholstery was worn. I didn't necessarily want to have the chair reupholstered, but I probably will eventually have the chair reupholstered because it's a good chair. It has natural down and feathers in the back cushion, which make it extremely comfortable and just inviting to sit on. But for now, it is just covered with a couple of quilts in a very, very simple manner. So we can also use sustainable techniques in our own homes, can't we? And as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, and as I will mention several times this semester, the practices and the techniques that I'm teaching you about, I hope that you'll start to figuring out how to kind of use that at home. And if you had some projects recently where you have recycled, like the sweater that I talked to you a minute about, or this wonderful blanket, or the way that I've done this chair, if you've had projects like this that you have done recently, I would love to see pictures of them. Shoot me an email with some pictures of some things that you've done, and I would really love to see them as you kind of develop this concept of your reduce, reuse, recycle in your own practices at home, and then eventually with your clients. All right, fast fashion, excuse me, is a concept from the fashion world, but we can learn a lot about it in terms of in terms of upholstery fabric. It's a concept where manufacturers copy designers and then mass produce fashion. We learned a little bit about this in the video with Anne Hathaway and Meryl Streep, how the lumpy blue sweater that she was wearing in the cerulean blue, millions of dollars of research had gone into that color, and then she eventually picked it up, out of a sale bin at, I don't remember what store they referred to. But look at where it all ends up. It all ends up in these heaps of garbage in trash piles. The average American, remember, throws away 65 pounds of textiles each year, including clothing, bedding, sheets, towels, and upholstery. We need to figure out ways of avoiding that, don't we? So one of the ways of doing that is by not buying this fast fashion in the first place. We need to think about this before we buy large amounts of cheap clothing and other textiles. So I'll always maintain that one good silk blouse will serve you much better than a dozen fast fashion blouses. I actually have a blouse I meant to show you, but I didn't grab it. It's from Eileen Fisher, and it actually has a label on it that says all of the Eileen Fisher. She's a particular designer that I enjoy. But all of her clothing has labels that say, I wish I had it handy to show you, but I don't. But the label says, "We want our clothes back. When you're done wearing our clothing, bring it back to us and we will recycle it." So they have a process in place for recycling their clothing. Eileen Fisher does. Sustainable design considerations for specific materials. So we certainly do not have perfect solutions to environmental problems, do we? But let's read about some of these on this particular slide. Number one, what impact do the clothes fibers have on the environment? We need to understand that textiles that are of a single fiber content are easier to recycle. If you have a couch that's upholstered in 100% cotton, that's going to be easier to recycle than if it's a cotton polyester blend, for example. Number two, how is the fiber processed into fabric? Things that you need to consider. Programs are apparently in place for recycling carpets and wall coverings, since most of those are of a single fiber content, for example, polyester. but most of these programs are not particularly viable yet. A few other things that need to be considered. It's hard for me to read this particular slide. It is a little bit small on my screen. How will the fabric be attached? How will the fabric be cleaned? Where is the fabric produced? What transportation is necessary? All things that need to be considered before fabric is purchased. Excuse me. Can the fabric be rolled, stored, packaged, and shipped with recyclable materials? What will be the useful lifespan of the material? What reuses for the fabric can be found? When fabric is on a piece of furniture, when it becomes worn, can it be reupholstered? So all these things that you have to think about in fabric, can it be reused? Wherever I go, people are wanting to give me their old fabric. When they know that I work in the fabric world, they are sure that I want all of their old fabric scraps. And I've learned to just say yes. The fabric that is given to me that is from somebody else's old pile is rarely useful to me. But people all the time are wanting to give me their old fabric. So I've learned just to say thank you, and then I immediately take it to a recycling bin, hoping that I'm passing it on to somebody else that can use it, even if I cannot. All right, we're nearing the end of our lecture, so let's review just a little bit. We've talked about the aesthetics of fabric, color, light, texture, pattern, market appropriate. So these are actually the characteristics of fabric. And we've talked about the designer's role in sustainability, green manufacturing, fabric end uses, considerations for specific materials. And we'll learn more about these specific materials in upcoming lectures and actually the characteristics of different kinds of fabric. Remember the clip from Devil Wears Prada shows us a little bit how important color is. In light, we talked about fabrics must be seen in the actual light that they're going to be used. I'm referring now again to the characteristics or aesthetics of fabric. We talked about texture. We didn't get to watch the video, but I told you how you can feel texture with your fingernails. Pattern, I hope you understand repeat now. If you didn't understand before, how to measure repeat on a fabric. We're going to talk about that several times in this semester, so you need to understand what the repeat of fabric is. Particularly in number 4, we'll talk about that more. Market appropriateness is certainly a little bit subjective. It depends on who your client is and what they feel like is appropriate, and that becomes even more important than what you think is important. As I've mentioned before, I suggest these principles are first practiced at home with your own textiles, your own clothing, and certainly your own furniture. And like I said, if you have things that you are recycling at home or reusing, I would love to see copies of them. That's certainly not something that's going to be graded, but I would love to see what you have done with recycling and reusing things at home. Okay, so that wraps up our first lecture. Let's talk just a little bit about your swatch kit. Hopefully you have received it in the mail this week. Hopefully you got that ordered. The interior design swatch kit, not the regular basic design swatch kit. And I think I probably need to, somebody said I need to update that in the assignments. I need to specify that it's actually the interior design swatch kit that you need to get. So what I want you to do, once you get this, you're going to receive a stack of fabric that comes with it. And the very first piece of fabric on the top of the pile should be this orange, I don't know how to show you this, this orange 100% cotton. Oh, it's the one that's in the image on the, excuse me, it's the image on your slide. So you've got to make sure that you keep these completely in order as you put them in your swatch kit. You're going to need to buy 2 rolls of 2-sided tape. On each of these, I put a piece of tape across the back, across the top of it, and then another piece of tape right in the middle of it. Because as you're going through these pages, you want these swatches to keep lying flat. You're going to have to be able to lift them up to look at the back side from time to time. We're going to be pulling individual fibers off the right and left side and off the bottom, so you need to lift it up. So 1 piece of tape across the top, This is two-sided tape that you're putting on the back of the fabric, and then another smaller piece right in the middle of it. And like I said, it took me 2 rolls of tape to do that. A few of them are going to need to be stapled in place unless you have any heavy-duty carpet tape. A few of them are just too heavy to be held in place by basic two-sided Scotch tape. And on those, go ahead and use like a staple gun or something on that. So go ahead, before next class, you need to get all of those fabric swatches in place, all 84 of them. And remember to put them in the exact order that they were received. And then you're going to add the name and the number right here. The number first, and then the name of the fabric, which you'll find in your class resources. All right, you've also got a video to watch for next week. It's called From Sheep to Cloth. So watch the video and submit a paragraph on Canvas about what you found interesting about the video. And I think that's about it for this week. It looks like we're up to just about an hour on this initial lecture. Our lectures will be anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half typically. This one is a little bit on the short side as we get started with this class. I check email a couple of times a week, so be patient. If you've sent me an email, give me a couple of days to respond to my campus email, trying to answer your questions. So hopefully you'll get your swatch kits right away, and you'll be able to complete this assignment by taping all 84 fabrics into the book. If your book hasn't come, make sure you're ready to go with 2 rolls of two-sided tape. And then you'll be able to record the number and the name of the fabrics in your swatch kit, and you'll watch the video before next week. So in general, you want to watch the video and do the assignment, or at least watch the video before my lecture, because I'll be referring back to the lectures each week. All right, so that's it for Lecture 1. Remember to send me any questions if you have questions about the class content, the assignments, anything else. Bye for now. I'll see you in lecture number 2.